So to start off, what we're seeing here is I saw this image. It immediately clicked in my mind as something majorly important to my monarch symbolism video, as well as monarch mind control symbolism. But what we're looking at is a cross image of the human brain during a CT scan. And as we can see here directly in the center, what makes this image so significant and so symbolic is what we're seeing is literally the monarch mind control. We are literally seeing why it is called monarch mind control. And again, you don't understand this, go back and see my previous video called Symbols and Power, discussing the elements in the symbols and the anatomy, the physiology of monarch mind control. So what we're seeing here in the center, what actually makes up the body of the monarch within the human brain, is called the first and second ventricle, which is the hippocampus of the human brain. It's the optic thalamus region. And the hippocampus is what we call Amun's horn. And that is what the first and second ventricle are. They make up the two wings of the monarch butterfly. And what would be the abdomen of the butterfly down below is what's called the third ventricle, which is also called the fornix, which means in etymology, the fornix means a vaulted chamber. And it's called a fornix or a vaulted chamber because, as we can see, the geometry here makes up an archway or a vault. It is the vault of heaven. The vault of heaven corresponding to the human skull, and the third ventricle or the fornix inside the brain, which is the vault of heaven corresponding to ancient Egyptian cosmology. And again, I mentioned that the fornix is called the fornix because it means an archway. And here we're looking at the Freemasonic, the Royal Arch. And later on in the video, I will tie this in as to why it's royal. Because here in just a minute, I'm going to point out to you why the innermost chamber of the brain, if you overlay the Great Pyramid on top of the brain, the King's and Queen's chamber of the Great Pyramid corresponds exactly to the innermost chamber of the human skull, which is the thalamus and the optic thalamus region where the pineal gland sits. So again, that's why it's called the King's Queen's chamber, and this is why it's located why it's the Royal Arch. And again, later on in the video, I'll explain more about why it's royal and how it relates to the royalty, to the pharaoh, the king cobra, the king serpent, the basilisk, which means king serpent, which again refers to royalty. So I'll cover that in depth again later on throughout the video. And the third ventricle is where the pineal gland is located, as well as the pituitary gland. And the pineal gland is obviously what we know as the third eye. So this third ventricle here is where we find the third eye, the third ventricle, the third eye, the vaulted chamber. And this is vaulted chamber, the fornix, is what if we place the image of the Great Pyramid directly over the human skull and line it up geometrically, this vaulted chamber, this third eye, this third ventricle, this fornix chamber directly corresponds to what's called the King's and Queen's chamber within the Great Pyramid of Egypt, of Giza. And so it's also what corresponds in biblical theology as Solomon's temple, the Holy of Holies. the innermost chamber. And this monarch image here, the hypothalamus, the optic thalamus region, is also where the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant, meaning an archway, as in the fornix, the vaulted chamber, the vault of heaven. The two wings of this monarch, the two wings correspond to the two cherubim, which guard the Ark of the Covenant, which are two sphinxes, whose wings are touching. And the etymology of the word fornix comes from fornis, which means furnace. And in this case, we're referring to where the eternal flame burns, the light of the mind, the pineal gland, the light of human consciousness, which is a photoreceptor. And again, go back to see my series called Symbols of Power to discuss the essence of light and the pineal gland being a photoreceptor. In other words, a receiver of light, which controls the human circadian rhythms, the regulation of sleep and consciousness. So inside the fornix, or the furnace, where the eternal flame burns, in Freemasonry it's known as the eternal flame. Just like the Olympic torch is lit and is kept burning throughout the entire games, which represents the eternal flame, the torch carried through the underworld of mythology, which is the light of consciousness. It's the light that is never extinguished. The light of consciousness, the enlightenment, the light of the mind. Enlightenment means light within the mind.
Yeah, it's like the the candle is the sacred flame. It's the keeping of the sacred flame.
The spirit.
The spirit. Which is why, in like the Olympics, you have to keep, and in Masonry they keep the torch lit, they keep the flame, the sacred fire burning, and obviously that's the spirit. It's the spirit it's the flame, it's the spark of light.
It's the burning light. It's the flame.
It's as David Bowie's Black Star song refers to as the solitary candle.
The mind's eye, the third eye, lies directly in the center of the human skull. The pineal is sensitive to light and generates its own source of perceptual light as dimethyltryptamine. It's known as the seat of the soul and the receptor of consciousness. It is the receiver of sight beyond sight.
The Eye of Thundera, a Thundercat's in danger.
The wavelength beyond the visible light spectrum of far infrared to ultraviolet. Your spiritual eyes, the eyes that you use to see when dreaming, the eyes that see in the dark when you sleep. The solitary candle that burns throughout the night. It is said, if thine eye be single, the whole body shall be full of light.
And notice how it's called the Villa of Ormond, which, when he says it in his English accent, sounds exactly similar to the Villa of Amen, which, as I've covered in one of my previous articles, the Villa of Amen of the human skull, the foramen being a hole where the nerves pass through. So it's the chamber of Amen, the solitary candle, the eternal flame, the light within the mind, the torch that bears through the underworld, the torch that is lit to carry through the underworld, to guide the passage through the underworld, to guide the way through death. and into rebirth and eternal life. And the word fornix is where we get the word fornication, because a fornix was also referred to as a vaulted chamber. In other words, it was linked and related etymologically to a brothel, or in other words, a place where you go for fornication. But in ancient times, which was known as sacred sexuality. So this vault, this arched chamber, this arch of heaven is also where we, linked to Freemasonry, is where we get the arch. And at the direct center of that arch, the most crucial component of the arch is the key, what's known as the keystone. And this next image that we'll take a look at is created to illustrate that the pons, which connects to the optic thalamus in the human brain, identically corresponds to the ancient hieroglyphic depictions of the deity called Ptah, or Ta, if you use the silent P, Pitta, which was phonetically pronounced Pitta, and I'll portray how it's more than just iconography and images or images that connect Ptah as the ophthalmos. In Egyptian mythology, Ptah, vocalized again as Pitta in ancient Egyptian, is the demiurge of Memphis, the god of creation, the arts, fertility, and craftsmanship. He is considered the demiurge who existed before all other things, and by his willfulness thought the world into existence. It was first conceived by thought and realized by the word. Pitta conceives the world by thought of his heart and gives life through the magic of his word. That which Pitta commanded was created, with which the constituents of nature, fauna, and flora are contained. A document known as the Memphite Theology shows the god Pitta responsible for creation of the universe by thought and by the word. And it's funny how this directly links to the Genesis creation story, long predating the Genesis creation story. The demiurge is from Latinized Greek demiurgos, literally public or skilled worker, the deity of craftsmanship, artisan. Demiurgos comes from demos, meaning common people. See demotic plus orgos, meaning the root word ergos, meaning work, which is linked to the etymology of the word organ. So the pineal gland and the pituitary gland are both organs, which does work. Hence the word ergos, as in demiurgos, or a small organ, which does work. So the pituitary gland is also linked to pitta, pituitary, pitta, a small organ which does work. This is an excerpt from Antoine Gigol's Crown and the Hero of the Sea. All this is leading us to the rudimentary eye in the human brain. The pitta linked to the word ophthalmos. Ophthalmos is ancient Greek meaning eye, as in the all-seeing eye, the pineal gland. The pitta that Iamblichus is writing about in his book De Mysteris Egyptorium, as the creative intellect, the Lord of the truth and knowledge, the pitta who will become pitta. All the past and all the secrets are in the words and the sounds. A long journey from the origins for the most sacred artifact of Egypt. The word ophthalmos, secularly described as being from the root words ops, meaning eye, see optic. A form related to thalamus, meaning inner room or chamber, or in other words, the third ventricle, the innermost chamber, the Holy of Holies. So ophthalmos, meaning eye, is a compound word composing of eye and thalamus, meaning inner room chamber of the inner eye. And I've gotten into arguments with Stephen Banker's of Spirit Science and Metaphysics website over all this theology and the etymology. He claims that ophthalmos can't possibly be talking about the pineal gland, can't possibly be referring to the third eye, and it simply is used in the context regarding the external eyes. But that is not true at all, and I will prove that through the etymology. See, again, they say that it comes from the word ops, meaning eye, plus thalamus. They would have you believe that ophthalmos is a compound word of ops plus thalamus, but that's not the case at all. The prefix of the word-forming element ophi OPHI, however, refers to a serpent or snake. So look at the word again. It's ophthalmos, not ophthalmos. From the point of view of biological evolution, the pineal gland represents a kind of atrophied photoreceptor, which means a receiver of light. In the epithalamus of some species of amphibians and reptiles, such as snakes, it's linked to a vestigial organ known as the parietal eye. A parietal eye, also known as a third eye or pineal eye, is photoreceptive, meaning receptive to light. It's a receiver of light, and it's sensitive to light, and it emits its own light, and is associated with the pineal gland, regulating circadian rhythmicity, sleep and wake cycle, and hormone production for thermal regulation, body temperature regulation. The very fact that thalamus alone means inner chamber is a dead giveaway that it's referring to the third eye, the Holy of Holies, as it corresponds to Solomon's temple, the third ventricle of the human brain, which is direct midline between the left and right ventricles, or the twin, which are known as the twin pillars. So it's the third pillar of Freemasonry, which stands directly between the two pillars of the sun and the moon, the left and the right hemispheres, the left and the right ventricle, the twin pillars, of which the third pillar stands directly in the center, hence the third eye and the third ventricle. So refer to this amulet of King Tutankhamun's tomb, the amulet of the Uraeus serpent, where the Uraeus symbol was made to represent the goddess Wadjet, which was the ancient Egyptian serpent goddess. It was a serpent deity. And what this amulet is depicting with the Uraeus is it's depicting snake eyes.
Snakes have sight beyond sight because they can see in the infrared spectrum. So in other words, they have heat vision. They can sense infrared heat. So they have thermal vision. So they can see beyond the typical spectrum of visible light that humans can see. So they have the sight beyond sight. And they sense this heat around them by taking in, they smell through their tongue, but they also send information into the heat sensing membranes, which allows them to have the thermal vision. And these two cones, or these cones of vision, overlap directly at the center, leaving a perfectly visible Vesica Piscis geometry visual pattern.
The eye of the snake, the third eye, the all-seeing eye, the parietal eye, a vestigial remnant of the reptilian anatomy, the reptilian physiology, which the human brain is segmented into three main segments. You have the pons, or in other words, the brain stem, which regards to survival and direct basic needs, and then you have the midbrain, which relates to emotions, and which is the mammalian brain, which relates to emotions and temperature regulation and hormone production. And then you have the newest development of the brain, which is the neocortex, which is related to higher thinking and higher cognitive abilities, rational functioning, problem solving. So the reptilian portion of the brain is referring to the most basic urges of human nature, which is survival, and the basic needs of human survival. Again, the inner eye, the third eye, as everyone knows by now, the pineal gland, is regulated by the Kundalini serpent energy of the body's central nervous ganglia. In other words, gangs or networks of glial cells, of glia, which are neural cells, which represents enlightenment, or in other words, light within the mind. The serpent energy represents life, rebirth, fertility, divinity, and royalty, as shown by the basilisk, which means king serpent, which comes from the root word of basil, which means king or royalty, basil or basil, king or royalty, which is exactly why the king pharaohs wore the uraeus cobra, or in other words, the king cobra on the third eye, which just so happens that the pons, the brainstem, and the thalamus portion of the inner brain is known as the reptilian complex, which corresponds to the very base of animal functioning, the basic animal nature, or in other words, the base, which means the very base of the human brain, the bottommost segment of the human brain, which relates directly to survival and instinct, which is why it's called the basal ganglia or the basal ganglia. Literally means the base of the brain. It's the most basic ganglia of the human brain, which is why the base of the brain, or the basal ganglia, looks exactly like a hooded cobra standing on its tail, standing erect. Exactly like the uraeus cobra on the pharaoh's third eye, stands erect, which is a direct representation of the pons. It's a direct representation of the reptilian complex of the human brain. It's a direct representation of royalty, of the king's chamber, of the third ventricle, the serpent, the snake eye. The pineal gland is the only midline brain structure that is unpaired or azygous. It's not directly bisymmetrical, and it takes its name from its pine cone shape, which follows a perfect golden ratio Fibonacci hypertrochoid pattern. Which is the fundamental basis of magnetism and every form of function in this universe. The serpent in the tree of knowledge represents the Kundalini energy rising up the spine, which is known as Jacob's ladder.
I showed you a demonstration a few days ago of the fact, now we're looking at the plane of inertia along this magnet, which is right down the center. It's not located there, but it's a pressure field mediation, which you can't cut it out. You can never cut out North Pole or South Pole. I explained this in great detail a few days ago. Okay, it's a plane of inertia. What happens is, over a greater spatial difference, the pressure mediation, and this is a string, this is too long for the dielectric inertia plane to sit at the center. If I take 2 or 3 magnets, me take off 2 of them here and put them down. Okay? If I just take 2 of these, the plane of inertia will sit right there in the middle. You can see it, right? Well, that's all well and fine. But with too great of a spatial distance, let's just say this is a longitudinal transmission here. This is really long. The plane of inertia can't sit at the middle here because there is too much spatial phase between this end and this end. So it cannot exist as a plane of inertia. Mother Nature works by simplex pressure mediation. So how does Mother Nature distribute, and I talked about this the other day, distribute the plane of inertia when the plane of inertia is too huge, i.e. a longitudinal transmission like this? As I showed you, if you're able to look up close, and you can buy a set of these if you want, these are just like 2mm cube neodymium iron borons. It distributes itself in a double helix and a vortex, exactly like, except this time it is inverse to light. Now the circuit of light, listen closely here. You better damn pay attention closely here, okay? In regular light, light is a coaxial circuit. We have transverse electrical and magnetic and a longitudinal plane of dielectric pulses. Actually, excuse me, the pulses are right here, where the electrical and magnetic are at their null point, okay? And with increasing frequency, like blue light, towards the blue end of the spectrum, we have more pulses, which is why we have, this is also the explanation for the photoelectric effect, which Einstein won a Nobel Prize for, but he made correct observations but incorrect conclusions. This is why we have more units of power on, like, say, blue light, okay, as opposed to red light. We could say this is red light and this is blue light. Okay, well, that's fine. We have transverse electrical and magnetic field perturbations resultant to the longitudinal dielectric pulses which exist here. The longitudinal, this is a coaxial circuit. You know what a coax cable looks like, right? You know, it has an outer sheathing of copper and a central conductor core. Coaxial circuit. Light is a coaxial circuit. We have electrical and magnetic transverse, okay? And we have longitudinal dielectric pulses, which occur here. Okay, now these are the power. By the way, this little thing right here is what the idiots of quantum mechanics and general relativity called das Lichtwand, or what the common idiot calls a photon. There's no such damn BS as a photon. It doesn't exist. It is a misunderstanding of a dielectric pulse, okay? Misunderstanding, big time misunderstanding. So, what does this have to do with high power? Not just power transmission wirelessly, we can do that. But high power, high directionality, non-lossy, meaning it's not, you spray out a water hose, water goes left, right, goes all over the damn place, right? A lot of it, you shoot out 100% of it, but only 10% of it reaches the target at the end, right? Okay, lossy. Some people are like, what are you talking about when you mean lossy? It means you shoot out 100%, but only 10% reaches your target. What we have here is, by creating a helicoil of the plane of inertia around an electrical longitudinal pulse perturbation, and I'm in direct contact with the person that I've seen demonstrate. They're not on YouTube, sorry, no. Now when you're seeking a patent and you made a huge discovery, you're not going to post videos on YouTube. You have a longitudinal electric. So now, at every transverse, we have the dielectric in a double helix, or the plane of inertia, that is corkscrewing around a pulse perturbation. And so what we're able to have is the holy grail of all humanity, that which, let me make a point here, the holy grail of what everybody's been scoffing at Nikola Tesla. Oh, that's not possible. No, that's not possible. The holy grail of what Nikola Tesla said was possible. And we said, no, it's not possible. Well, it is possible. Longitudinal wireless high voltage transmission. Here's the real holy grail in actuality. At least this is what my buddy calls it. Wireless high voltage transmission.
as I've covered in the last series, which you need to go back and understand how the vault of heaven relates to is referring to the body, the various places as above, so below in the body, the sexual regions as well as the brain and the skull, the mind. So I want you to pay attention here. What you're looking at is again Jeb and Nut, and Jeb impregnates the sky. The earth impregnates the sky, so what you're looking at again is the world pillar, the cosmic pillar, a direct correspondence with the human skull. As depicted here, you have the human spine as the cosmic pillar, the world pillar, which supports the vault of heaven, the cranial vault. You have the cosmic pillar, the world pillar, which supports the cranial vault. So in other words, you have the omphalos of the world, which impregnates the cranial vault, which impregnates the sky. So you have the pillar which impregnates the sky. And again, as I showed a second ago, with the power symbol, again you have the phallic which impregnates the arch, the archway. The arch is feminine, the curve is feminine, the phallic is the pillar. So in the human body you have the diencephalon, the basal ganglia, which impregnates the neocortex, the human spine, which impregnates the vault of heaven. This is universal cosmology, the macrocosm of the microcosm within the macrocosm. This is the torus dynamic. Exact same story of a Greek mythology of Atlas, of the Titan Atlas, who is a personification of the mountains, who holds up or supports the celestial sphere. Hyginus emphasizes the primordial nature of Atlas by making him the son of Ether and Gaia. In other words, the son of space and earth, the pillar of support, the support structure of the celestial sphere above the sphere of the earth. Atlas's symbol is the globe, which is why we have the atlas, which is where we get the atlas bone of the spine, which is the atlas bone of the spine, which supports the globe of the skull, the microcosm of the macrocosm. The vault of heaven and the vault of heaven below the waist, below the belt, is that the serpent represents the human spinal column, and that human spinal column, the Kundalini serpentine energy ascends up the spinal column to the pineal gland inside the center of the skull, which the spinal column is the column which holds up the cosmic, which is the cosmic pillar, and the golden egg lies in the center of your brain, the thalamus, or the diencephalon, or the putamen. So again, remember from the part 2 presentation where I depicted the ganglia, or the basal ganglia, being the aureus serpent. So again, this is why the spinal column and the egg, the serpent and the opus and the ovum, the spinal column and the thalamus within the brain, which again, this is a summation of everything that I've shown in this presentation. And again, this is the significance of the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, or Osiris climbing the ladder to heaven, and Jacob ascending the ladder to heaven, where he comes face to face with God and is names this place Pineal, or Pineal, because again, this is the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, where he ascends the ladder, where he climbs the spinal ladder to heaven and attains the golden egg laid by the golden goose, and then he returns to earth with the golden egg, the golden mean ratio, the creation of life, bringing forth of life into matter, and how Jack is the same as Jacob, the Jacob, Yaakov. So this is the very same story as Jacob's ladder, as Jacob who ascends the ladder to heaven, just as Osiris ascends the ladder to heaven, which again I've covered the Jacob's ladder story in the previous presentation of the series. All of these myths, these stories, and these archetypes are referring directly to the anatomy and the physiology of the human body, of the temple, the inner temple. And I found this image, surprisingly, as I was actually looking for the Vesica Pisces to relate to this innermost chamber here in the brain as well, to relate it to how certain segments of the fornix here directly correspond geometrically to the vagina, as well as the pineal relating to the clitoris. And I'll show that geometry here in a second. But what we can see is the vesica piscis here related to the geometry of a butterfly. So again, the vesica piscis relating to the innermost chamber here, the first, second, and third ventricles of the optic thalamus. And here, as I was just mentioning, we can see, again, which I mentioned was the innermost chamber, the fornix, the third ventricle, as well as the first and second ventricles of the optic thalamus. So this is an image that I found quite a while ago of a CT scan of the human brain is what we're looking at here. And as soon as I saw this, I immediately made a mental connection of the geometry that I was looking at. And what I immediately saw was how the vesica piscis fits here within the two hemispheres of the human brain, making up the geometry of this third ventricle, which falls direct midline of the bilateral symmetry of the human body. And so what we're looking at directly corresponds to the female vagina, or in other words, here we can see the prepuce right here of the clitoris, and here would be the clitoral frenulum, the frenulum clitoridis, which, as we can see, directly corresponds with the brain. Here we've got the two branches, which would be either the bulb of the vestibule or the two major labia, the labia majora, the two lips of the vagina, and again the frenulum of the clitoris, the frenulum clitoridis here at the top, which joins the two. And yet again, as I was just describing, we can see the obvious geometric similarities and the correspondences between what is as above to what is below within the female anatomy. And again, as I was mentioning, we can see the similarities. You have the clitoris and the frenulum clitoridis, the body of the clitoris, within the human brain as well, as we can see the exact same corresponding geometry. And again, the vesica piscis making up the two hemispheres of the human brain, or at least the third ventricle within the human brain, the optic thalamus region, the ophthalmos, the all-seeing eye within the human body.
I was wondering if maybe you wanted to get together. I know there's a lot of stuff I'd like to say.
Whispering eye.
So if you get a chance, give me a call back and we can see each other. I'd love to see you.
And our whispering eye.
And your whispering eye. All right. Bye. Whispering eye.
It means vagina. It means vagina.
It's a classy move, man.
It means vagina.
Yeah. Get your whispering eye in the cab, Aussie.
Where he mentions the vagina, a reference to the vagina, and he calls it a whispering eye. And it's a funny little joke there, but again, you have the all-seeing eye within the human body. And I was mentioning the vesica piscis in the human brain, and again how it corresponds to the clitoris here geometrically in the vesica piscis, where the clitoris is located in the vesica piscis, and that also corresponds to the male anatomy. Here is, obviously I couldn't find an adequate graphic to portray what I'm talking about. So I just drew this simple image of what we're looking at is actually the male glands. We're looking at the male penis head, which holds the same geometry of the vesica piscis as well. But so we're looking at how the male anatomy also follows the same sacred geometry, the vesica piscis, same as the female vagina. And again, same as within the human brain. So both the male and the female both correspond to as above, so below the belt.
And since we're on the male anatomy corresponding to the human brain, as above, so below the belt, here what we're looking at is the pituitary gland, which hangs down from the hypothalamus area. And as we're looking at this, it basically needs no explanation, although I'm here explaining it anyways. The similarity between the male genitalia and as above, so below the belt. The pituitary gland and the male testicles. So as above, so below the belt. Again, one of the only glands that falls at the direct midline of the human brain, and again, one of the only organs that falls at the direct midline of the human anatomy.
So this is called the diencephalon, and it's referred to as the cephalic portion of the brain, relating to the diencephalon, which etymologically comes from cephalic, pertaining to the head, from Latin cephalicus, from cephalicos, pertaining to the head. Cephalic contains the word phallic within it. Cephalic, pertaining to the head.
As above, so below the belt.
This brings us to the direct correspondence between the vocal cords and the vagina of as above, so below the belt. Therefore they shall know in that day that I am who speaks. Behold, I am. The vocal cords, along with the vagina, and as I'm covering here, as well as the third ventricle of the brain, are all represented correspondence of the all-seeing eye and the triangle, as I'm covering here in this segment. All three are intrinsically linked by form, function, and energy. The vocal cords are the gateway of our words, from where words are birthed or ejaculated into existence. The thyroid gland, as well in the throat, is a direct bilateral symmetrical representation, as I've already shown throughout this presentation, somewhat resembling the butterfly, again the bilateral symmetry. Hence the link between fertility problems and the thyroid gland. Many thyroid diseases such as Hashimoto's thyroiditis create problematic symptoms such as infertility. Hashimoto's is 7 times more common in women than in men. Some women experience thyroid issues after pregnancy, around 7%. Abnormalities in the thyroid function, and particularly hyperthyroidism, can have an adverse effect on reproductive health and result in reduced rates of conception, increased miscarriage risk, and adverse pregnancy and neonatal outcomes. Also mirroring the butterfly shape is the brain's 2 anterior horns of the lateral ventricles, when viewed as a cross-section from the superior view, or above. Also positioned penetrating of this bilateral symmetry is the septum pellucidum. Hyperthyroidism, or an overactive thyroid gland, can cause anxiety, irritability, and mood swings, while hypothyroidism can cause mental slowing and memory problems as well as depression. So the actual case is that all glands become hyper before they become hypo. In other words, they become overactive and struggling to produce the hormones that is necessary to achieve homeostasis in the body. And they're working so hard against these toxins in our body that they eventually burn themselves out from working too hard, and then they slow down and begin to stop working, and that is when they enter into the hypo state, or in other words, the underactive production. You start to see how all three, the throat, the brain, and reproductive organs, are directly linked. Now this brings us to the uvula in the throat, or in the tonsils. It's positioned along the body's central meridian line, or in other words, the sushumna, just as the clitoris and the pineal gland, all of which are azygous. And all of these glands resemble the exact same shape. Which brings us back to what I wanted to show, how the clitoris directly corresponds. Clitoris comes from the related Greek noun form kleis, which has a second meaning of a key, a latch, or a hook, which is why the clitoris is like a latch or a hook on a door. Alternatively, perhaps related to Greek cleitus, a variant of clitus, meaning side of a hill, itself related to klinine, to slope. So this is exactly why the clitoris is located on the side of the hill, or in other words, on the side of the pubic mons, the pubic mound, the mons pubis. From the same root as climax, and with the sense of little hill. Some ancient medical sources give a supposed Greek verb, klitoriazine, to touch or titillate lasciviously, to tickle. Compare German slang, der Kitzler, clitoris, literally the tickler. So this brings us to climax. Climax comes from Greek climax, literally ladder, from the root of clinine, to slope, which is the same root of clitoris. Series of steps by which a goal is achieved, to escalating steps. High point of intensity or development. So again, the steps, the ascension, the ladder to heaven. This is exactly why the climax, this is exactly why the climax is the culmination of the ascension of the ladder to heaven, which is why the orgasm is the experience of the rising of the energy to a heavenly experience, to a culmination, which I will explain further here in the presentation, which takes us back exactly to the direct linguistic as well as symbolic and functional correspondence. So the glands is literally the shape of an acorn, just as most glands. From Latin glandula, gland of the throat or the tonsil. So this etymologically directly links the glands of the penis and the clitoris to the throat, or in other words, the uvula. They are literally etymologically linked as well. All three are unique unto themselves, yet connected intrinsically between each other. The uvula hangs like a bunch of grapes. Comes from etymologically, uva is Latin for grapes. It contains glands that secrete saliva, the salt, the salvation, the salivation. Just as stimulation of the clitoris increases lubricant secretion production in the vagina, stimulation also causes the uvula to secrete throat lubricating saliva. So in other words, we have the direct link between the uvula and the clitoris, and the stimulation and secretion of the lubrication of the saliva, the salt, the salvation, the chrism, the oil, the cream, the secretion, the sacred secretion.
They're shooting! If those are the teeth, and that's the tongue, then that must be the uvula. Oh, so it's a girl house. What?
It's been suggested that the uvula is primarily an accessory speech organ, which is indeed what it is. The uvular sound is not present in any other life form but humans, and it is language which defines us from all other animals. In many languages, the uvula is used to articulate a range of consonant sounds, known as uvular consonants. It's responsible for the voiced uvular trill, written in the International Phonetic Alphabet as R. In the movie Deep Throat, a doctor identifies the main character's uvula as being her missing clitoris. This becomes a central plot for the movie that later became the namesake of the informant in the Watergate trials, leading to Richard Nixon's impeachment. Watergate. Interesting term. Stargate, the gateway, the gate of God, her gateway, her Watergate. In other words, the uvula produces the saliva, or the liquid, the fluid. It's the Watergate. It is the gateway, just as the vagina is the gateway, both the gateways of birth and creation. And the brain is also a direct correspondence between the throat and the vagina. So the throat is a direct correspondence between the brain and the vagina. So it goes from the brain to the throat to the sacral regions. All of these things are in direct correspondence with each other because they're all essential in the process of creation. You create mentally, and you create vocally and verbally, and you create physically with your genitalia. This is the genesis. This is the birth of the Holy Trinity. The vibration, the thought becomes the vibration, becomes the sound. And the light then becomes matter. God is in the vibration. So this is why the language is so important. And this refers to the languages that were dispersed in Babylon. And Babylon, or Akkadian Bavalim, is the gateway of God. In other words, the vaginal, the throat, the vibrational gateway of God. So what we're looking at here is a diagrammatic comparison of the human brain as well as the male pelvis. We're seeing the similarity of what we have obviously here is the phallic septum pellucidum, which penetrates directly between the bilateral hemispheres of the brain. So in other words, you have the phallic penetrating the feminine. Again, as I am and I have pointed out throughout the presentation, is the human brain geometry related to the Vesica Pisces, which actually the human brain follows the same geometry up. So again, here we're clearly seeing the phallic penetrating the feminine. So we have the duality creating the geometry of the human form. So we have the septum pellucidum here penetrating down, and this is an exact, well, not an exact, but it's a very similar geometric structure as the human pelvis. As we're seeing here, we have the cross-section of the prostate and the fascia of the prostate and the sheath of the prostate, which penetrates down into the bulb of the penis, just as the septum pellucidum and the third ventricle penetrates down into the fourth ventricle, directly penetrates the bilateral symmetry. And you can see sort of the butterfly wing-shaped pattern of the lateral ventricles, as I've covered in the previous 2.5-hour presentation of the monarch butterfly within the human brain. And so again, we're seeing the butterfly symmetry of the pelvis, which I just showed with the human pelvis and the sphenoid bone. And this is another cross-section of the pelvis directly relating to the human brain as well, with the same geometry. Now, I know this isn't exact, but if you pay close attention, you can see the similar geometries here. You can see the wings cross from both sides here. You can see the prostate area cross-section here penetrating down, just as the lateral ventricles penetrate down to the third ventricle, down to the fourth ventricle. So again, you can see with the bulb here, the bulb of the penis and the bulbous fourth ventricle down towards the brain stem, towards the cerebellum down here. So again, you can see the clear similarities. Although it's not identical, you can see the same, you can see the resemblant structure. Now, I almost forgot to mention here that the prostate is also what produces crucial and critical seminal fluid, which provides the main component of semen, or the fluid of reproduction. And just as the ventricles within the brain are also the main component which produces the cerebrospinal fluid, the main fluid, the main component, which I'm going to cover here further in depth here in just a moment in the video, about the crucial aspect of the seminal fluid and the cerebrospinal fluid as well. And since we're on the areas of the septum pellucidum and the lateral ventricles, this is obviously the same geometry as the Greek letter psi. Again, here you have the wings or the chalice. You have the chalice, the Holy Grail. You have the Holy of Holies here within the lateral ventricles, and the third ventricle, which penetrates the two. So again, you have the chalice and the masculine penetrating that chalice, the blade in the chalice. You have the masculine penetrating the feminine, the penis penetrating the womb, the symbol of the psi, the Holy Trinity. And again, this is the Greek letter psi, which relates to the psi, which means the mind, the psyche. So you have psi and psi. The similarities of the language are not just similar by coincidence or by accident. There's a specific reason, because psi, S-P-S-Y, comes from the Greek psi, meaning parapsychology, a form of mental energy, a form of psychic energy. And as I was explaining far earlier towards the beginning of the presentation about the sai, or being used as the trident, as the weapon of the trident, in reflection of the destruction, the destructive principle of Neptune and Poseidon, as well as Shiva, the creator, preserver, and destroyer, in reflection is of the mind, referring to the destructive power of the mind, which must be overcome and must be balanced through meditation and healthy practices. It must be balanced out. And that is why the aspect of Shiva is again depicted with the serpent wrapped around his neck in a benevolent form, signifying that he has overcome, he has come to a perfected state of ascension and overcome the destructive nature of the serpent within himself. He has risen the Kundalini, he has risen the Uraeus. And again, as I've covered in the previous presentation, when you see one holding the serpent, it signifies that they've tamed the serpent. This is very unique and very interesting. The Vedic Devata called Ganesh represents the ventral view of the human brain. This is from Professor Tony Nader, medical doctor, PhD in human physiology. Expression of Veda and the Vedic literature, page 333. Funny numerology there. The Vedic Devata are the various aspects of natural law that organize the entire universe and maintain it in perfect order. They are the laws of nature, or collections of laws of nature, with specific administrative functions that provide for the creation, maintenance, and dissolution of the universe. The Devata are integral aspects of our own human physiology, as well as our human psychology. They are embodied in every human being with the same forms and functions described in the Vedic literature. The Devata are present in the physiology of everyone, no matter what one's race, belief system, or religion, no matter which political party one's associate with, or in which geographical area one is born. The ventral view of the human brain, which is the brain seen from underneath, shows the clear correspondence between the Vedic Devata Ganesh and the pons, the medulla, and the cerebellum. The face of Ganesha corresponds to the pons. The medulla corresponds to the trunk of Ganesha, the trunk of Ganesh. The roots of the trigeminal nerves represent the eyes of Ganesh. A group of nerves at the pons represent the tusks of Ganesh, as we can see here in figure 8. The cerebellum constitutes the ears of Ganesh. These structures not only look just exactly correspondent to Ganesh, but their functions in human physiology correspond to the functions and activities ascribed to Ganesh. Ganesh's place is at the door of the brain, called the medulla. The enlarged image shows 2 big ears, a trunk, and tusks. So Ganesh sits at the door of the mind. He is the gatekeeper, and he decides who should go in or not. If a negative influence tries to enter the brain, he stops it right there. Therefore, he is called the Vina Vinayaka, remover of obstacles. These obstacles are of the mind. And notice specifically that one of the key aspects of Ganesh is the symbol of the sai, located on the forehead or the third eye. Again, the sai of the psychology. And I know it would be easy for one to be skeptical about this and assume that this drawing of the human brain is just emphasizing a likeness to Ganesh. But this would not hold water, because you can look up any ventral view of the human brain, and you can see that this is exactly correspondent, which is likened to Ganesh. So once again, we also have the phallic representation located within the human brain. Again, this is obviously the image of the elephant, but it's obviously a phallic representation, visibly phallic in nature. And I want to make sure that you understand this here in reference to Ganesha and the human brain. So you have to notice the exact representations of the symbolism, which is that the Ganesha has the distinct division down the very center of his trunk, just as the human pons and the human spinal cord directly represents the division of the brainstem of the pons into 2 segments which are known as the pyramids of the brain, the direct division down the trunk, which are the pyramids. And the central tusks, which would represent the tusks of Ganesha, are the accessory nerves, and also the vagus nerves, where the Christ is crucified at the 33rd degree, at the 33rd vertebrae, the base of the human spine, of the basal ganglia, where the cerebrospinal fluid crosses and is crucified by the vagus nerve on either side. It is crucified between the vagus nerves. And so also depicted very distinctly in the artwork of Ganesha is the depiction of the third eye, or the pineal gland, which is located directly here, which would be the third eye of Ganesha, of the elephant, which the pineal gland would be located in the human brain right here, but on the top of the diencephalon. So this is the bottom view of the the bottom view of the pons, and the bottom view of the brain, where the pineal gland is located right here at the top of the diencephalon. And then depicted on the crown of Ganesha is direct correspondence. Notice the little dot is the exact location of the pituitary gland. So again, located right on the psi of Ganesha's forehead, the psi, the psychology, the psyche, is the exact location of where the pineal gland is located in the brain, at the top of the diencephalon. And then you have the little gem on the crown of Ganesh is the exact representation of the location of the pituitary gland. This is the pituitary gland, located right at the base of the optic chiasma. And again, the tusks, this is right where the vagus nerves attach to the base of the brainstem, attached to the basal ganglia. This image here is the correspondence of the Egyptian Atef crown, which was typically worn by Osiris, which likely represents the lotus blossom, the conical shape of the head, the conical shape of the lotus blossom, which the Atef crown worn by Osiris typically depicted the Oreos serpent located directly on the third eye, and was flanked by two of the feathers, ostrich feathers, which were said to have represented possibly the Bennu bird. And again, the key aspects of the Atef crown, as related here, was the Oreos sun disk located on the third eye, or representing the pineal gland, the enlightenment of the third eye, a direct representation of the glands located within the human brain, and the correspondence between the Atef crown and the human brain, and particularly the essential organs of the human brain, which is the correspondence of the two glands. You have the pineal gland, as depicted as the very center of the ventral view of the human brain. You have the two ostrich feathers, the two flanking ostrich feathers of the Atef crown. You have the location of the pineal gland and the location of the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is located right here, directly beneath the optic chiasma of the brain, and the pineal gland located at the direct center at the top of the diencephalon. Again, depicted with the Osirian Atef crown. And again, you have the two serpents of the Kundalini, the Pingala, the Ida and the Pingala, the two serpents which run the circuit of the human nervous system all the way down the spine and up, finally climaxing at the human brain in the left and right ventricles of the human brain, and the circuit, the arcing between the two glands of the two electrical glands of the brain, the pineal and the pituitary, the masculine and the feminine, or vice versa, since the pituitary is actually represents the pair of balls, and the pineal is located directly in the vesica piscis, as I've just shown here. This is the accurate depiction of the Ordeos serpent of the human brain. You have the spinal column, you have the central nervous ganglia coming up the basal ganglia up into the pons, which again, you have to view the whole thing as a single view the whole thing view this as the cobra. The cobra rising up the human spine, and again, Ordeos literally means to climb up, or to rise, to climb, as in to climb a hill, to ascend the mountain, to ascend the hill, as I've covered here in the presentation. So the Ordeos rises up the spine, it penetrates through the king's queen's chamber, and it penetrates out through the third eye, from the pineal through the pituitary, penetrates out through the forehead. So view this whole thing as the single serpent rising up, and it has ascended and it has risen out. That is the actual depiction of the Ordeos serpent. That is the actual legitimate representation of the Ordeos serpent. Right there. Imagine the serpent, imagine the cobra, the king cobra rising out. That is the symbol of the enlightenment. The enlightenment has risen up and risen out. And this is significant because, as I've shown throughout this presentation here, what will tie this all together is this image here, and this is significant to the Atef crown, as I will show here in a second, is because, as I've mentioned, Osiris, who climbs the ladder to heaven to commune with Nut, or the sky, is this image is depicting here is a 7-stepped pyramid, or a 7-stepped ladder to heaven, of which Osiris was known as the god of the staircase. And so the symbolism here is very obvious to what I'm showing throughout this presentation, is the reason why this is the exact reason why it shows the serpent ascending the staircase, and it shows the serpent as at the divide point in the exact same image as I'm showing here as the Hebrew letter Hebrew resh, which means head, right there. And the basal ganglia of the brain corresponding to the Ordeos serpent, which is why the Ordeos serpent is at the divide between the lower base of the pyramid, or in other words, the Jed pillar, the spine, the cosmic pillar, the world cosmic axis, and this is why the serpent divides between the spine, and Osiris sits upon the throne. He sits upon the mercy seat with the Atef crown above, which is the thalamus. The omphalos, the cosmic axis, the world pillar, which penetrates into the skull which penetrates into the skull. The throne of heaven within your skull, within the center of your brain, the thalamic region of the thalamus of the brain, wearing the Atef crown, which is the thalamic region of the brain. Yeah, it's obvious to see the correspondence between the muscle structure of the perineum and how it directly relates to the human form. In other words, I guess you could say this is the fractal, the larger fractal of what is within. As within, so without. We've got the human structure right here within the human genitalia. And this is why the human sexuality and the sexual organs are so sacred. And we can see the similarities of this here is the gluteus maximus muscle, so in other words, it's the butt muscle, and it's in the exact corresponding spot as you sit in meditation or yoga, you sit on your gluteus maximus. And we can see the similarities here, the similar shape between the hands, which when we look deeper into the symbolism of the hands, that is actually the vesica piscis, as I just mentioned, which corresponds to the female anatomy, which corresponds to the female sexuality. Which, if we go in even deeper into the anatomy, corresponds to the Virgin Mary, And in the anatomy, we have the hood, which forms the labia minora. Again, this is what's called the prepuce, the clitoral prepuce, and the hood of the Virgin Mary. And again, the praying hands referring to the goddess, the female anatomy, the female goddess aspect. Stedman's medical dictionary describes the innermost layer of the brain as tender mother. The innermost layer, the pia mater, which is Latin, again, tender mother, is a thin, delicate membrane that inspired some early neuroanatomists with a poetical bent to compare the way this membrane envelops the brain to the gentleness of a mother caressing her infant. Note again, the medical dictionary refers to this inner part of the brain as a mother caressing her infant. Does this begin to make sense to you as to who the Virgin Mother is? The outermost layer of the brain matter is called the dura mater, meaning tough mother, and the inner layer, the pia mater, the tender mother, between the two lies a reticulated layer of tissue called the arachnoid, whose appearance reminded one of a spider's web. Arachnoid, the web, the curtain, the veil. It's in the brain, separating the outer from the inner, just as the temple veil separates the inner from the outer. Arachnoid literally in Latin means old spider mother. The Native Americans have legends of Spider Grandmother, who is the creator of heaven, who wove the web of the stars. Just as in our neuroanatomy we have the web woven of neural connections, just as in the universe we have the web of neural connections within the mind of the universe. So again, we've covered the meanings of sacred, sacral, as well as the sacral energies, the sacred sacral energies, which revolve around sex, impulse, urges, survival, and the sacral regions, in other words, the sacred sexual regions, the reproductive glands are also where we find the sacred secretions, the secretions of the sacred hormones. Hormone comes from hormone, meaning urge, impulse, instinct. In other words, our first most basic urges. The words secrete and secret are etymologically linked. The secrete, the secretions, the sacred secretions, the sacred secret. So again, this links directly the connections between the sacral region, the sexual regions, and the pineal gland, as well as the pituitary gland in the brain, which also produce the sacred secret, the secretions of the hormones, of the hormone, the urge, the impulse. So again, this directly links the as above, so below the belt. As within the brain, so below the belt. And again, the fornix and the pia mater, or in other words, the vault of heaven, and the tender mother, and her vault within the brain, the vesica piscis. So the chrism, the Christ, sits within the vesica piscis, the tender mother, in the arms of the pia mater, of the tender mother. And within the brain, the word Christ comes from Latin and Greek, chrism, Christos, or oil. And these are all of these are the holy anointing oils. They are the sacred secretion. And the pia mater, the tender mother, actually produces 70% of the body, of the cerebrospinal fluid. In other words, the pia mater, the tender mother, literally produces the Christ. The pia mater literally produces the chrism, the cerebrospinal fluid, the holy, the sacred oil, the anointing oil. Like a thermometer, the cerebrospinal fluid circulates via pressure variations from proper breathing technique and blood pressure. It must be kept clean or pure, or it will stagnate and cause disease. The cerebrospinal fluid, the Christ, gets crucified at the blood-brain barrier and the vagus nerve. the 33rd vertebrae. The Christ, the CSF, is produced and born in the fornix. It travels down, or in other words, the cave. It travels down, or the manger. It travels down the spine and rises up again like the phoenix after being crucified at the blood-brain barrier at the 33rd degree. Christ is crucified at the 33rd, age 33, the 33rd vertebrae, called Golgotha, the place of the skull. It is sanctified, consecrated at the inner sanctum, the womb, and the tomb. A sanctum means the innermost chamber. In other words, the third ventricle, the Holy of Holies. He comes from the womb and ends up in the tomb. The birth and the death, the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega. Active production of spinal fluid, CSF, requires energy to cause the cell linings to the ventricles to secrete salt into the ventricles. The root word salve is where we get salvation, salivation, the salt of the earth. Salt saves. It's a preservative. Christ is the anointed one. And you anoint something by anointing it with the sacred fluid, the milk, the cream. This brings us back to Proto-Indo-European root gu, to pour a libation as the root word for God. This is why you have to get down on your knees to receive the sacred cream, to receive the fluid onto your head, to get anointed with the sacred fluid, with the cream, the milk, the oil, to the land of milk and honey. What's the only substance that is sticky like honey, the consistency of honey, and is the color of milk? What is the only substance? It's the sacred secretion. It is the semen, from where we get the words like seminary, seminal. Seminary literally means a breeding ground, from seminarius, meaning of seed, literally from semen. The genitive is semenis, seed. The semen, the seed. The cum, meaning with or together. Meaning school for training priests. Commonly used for any school, but especially academies for young ladies. Literally a breeding ground. And this is why in the Catholic churches, this is why we find the pedophilia. This is why they're always associated with the children and the sex scandals, the pedophilia, the sex trafficking. Most religious terminology and symbology is rooted and stems from the seed or the seminal, literally from the seed of ancient fertility rites, rites of passage, and sex. Because the sacral regions are where the most nerve endings in the body are located. And this is why when you have an orgasm, you have a godly experience. You have a communion with God. A cum-union, with Latin root word cum, does indeed connect etymologically to sex. Latin cum meaning with or together. And the only way that you come is you come with, or you come together as one. You become one with God. You come together with your sexual partner. Sure, you can do it individually, but it comes from together. It comes from two, being together or multiple. So it does link etymologically with the word come. And so when you graduate with honors or cum laude, you are indeed graduating or being anointed with the benefits. You are receiving the benefits. You're receiving the blessing. You're reaping the fruits of your labor. Just as the child is the fruit of the woman's labor, you're being anointed with the benefits.
The knowledge of all the universe is evil. You keep them away from it through fear. You tell them to fear it at all costs. Therefore, they will never awaken. They will never have knowledge. That is how you control humanity.
And as always, thank you guys for taking the time to watch the video. If you're new to my channel, make sure to subscribe to the button down below, hit the bell notification button next to that, and click get notifications for the channel. That way you're not missing any of the future updates.
so that way you continue to get notifications from my future videos and my future presentations as well. If you haven't yet, you can receive updates from all of my full research articles and all of my full video presentations on my patreon.com/liftingtheveil. That way you're not missing out on any of my full research presentations, and you can cite all of my sources, and you can also choose to support my work from there as well if you appreciate it. Thanks for your time. Y'all have a good one. Keep lifting the veil.